The knife went in at a slant, the way you'd bleed a wound to see how deep it ran. Arlen Whitcomb pressed the blade against a vine as thick as his wrist, gray and cracked like driftwood, and drew it back in one clean motion. Bark curled away in a ribbon. Underneath, for half a second before the morning air touched it, the wood glowed a wet, stubborn green. He didn't smile. He'd stopped letting himself smile at things too early. But he pressed his thumb into the cambium and felt it give like living skin, and something in his chest loosened that had been tight for 2 years. Talking to the dead again, Arlen. He didn't turn around. He knew the voice, Royce Tanner, who ran the feed store and considered himself the unofficial mayor of every conversation held within 100 yards of his truck. Vines aren't dead, Royce. Could have fooled the whole county. Royce's boots crunched gravel as he ambled up to the fence line, one arm slung over the top rail like he owned it. He looked past Arlen at the field, 4 acres of vines gone wild and gray, canes twisting into each other like barbed wire left in the rain for a decade. Ruth's granddaddy planted these before my daddy was born, and even he let him go before he died. You're back there every morning like you're gonna raise Lazarus. Folks in town don't call it Hollow Row anymore, you know that. I know what they call it. The grave. Royce said it like he was doing Arlen a favor, warning him gently. Ground like that don't come back, Arlen. You're grieving a piece of dirt because it's easier than grieving Ruth. Arlen turned the knife over in his hand, watching the green wood catch the early light. Get off my fence, Royce. He went back to cutting. Behind him, boots retreated, gravel crunched, an engine turned over. Arlen didn't look up until the truck was gone. Then he knelt in the wet dirt between 2 rows that hadn't seen a single grape in 11 years, and he kept cutting, vine after vine, checking each one for the green underneath the gray, because he'd promised somebody a long time ago that he would, and because everybody in Cutter's Hollow was wrong, and he was the only one who knew it. Cutter's Hollow sat in a fold of hills nobody had bothered naming on any map worth mentioning. A scatter of white clapboard houses, one blinking traffic light, and a Baptist church whose steeple was the tallest thing for 6 miles. The Belhaven Valley wrapped around it in low green ridges, vineyards climbing the slopes on either side like something out of a postcard nobody had printed yet. Arlen Whitcomb had lived there 60 of his 71 years, and for 43 of them. He'd lived in the ironworkers' world of scaffolding and rebar in 3 different cities, before coming home to marry Ruth Colby and take over her family's land almost by accident the way you take over a garden nobody else wants to weed. Hollow Row had been beautiful once. Ruth used to tell him about harvests when she was a girl, whole families out in the rows with buckets, her grandfather singing hymns off-key while he worked the press, the whole valley smelling like crushed fruit for 2 weeks every September. But that had been before Arlen's time, before even Ruth's father's time, really. By the time Arlen married into the family, the vines were already going quiet, tended just enough to keep the county from condemning the property, never enough to actually produce. Ruth used to say her grandfather had a reason. She never said what it was. Arlen had asked once, early in their marriage, and she'd gotten a look on her face he only ever saw twice more in 38 years of marriage. The day her father died, and the day the doctor told her the cancer wasn't going to let go this time. Some things you let grow wild on purpose, she told him. People stop looking at what they think is already dead. He hadn't understood it then. He was starting to understand it now, 2 years after her funeral, kneeling in dirt that everyone else in town had already buried. Inside the farmhouse that evening, Arlen sat at the kitchen table with a bank envelope he hadn't wanted to open all day. He'd known what was in it before he slid it, the same letter, different month, same weight of dread each time. He read it twice. 90 days. 90 days to bring the loan current, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the property described as Hollow Row Vineyard, 4.2 acres, Cutter's Hollow Township. The loan wasn't even his doing, not really. Ruth had taken it out 8 years back to cover a surgery, using the land as collateral because there was nothing else to put up. He'd been paying on it steady since she died, working 3 days a week doing welding repair for the county to keep it current. But a cracked hip last spring had eaten 4 months of income he didn't have to spare, and now here he was. He set the letter down and looked out the window at the dark shapes of the vines in the last gray light, and for the first time in 2 years, he let himself be afraid instead of just stubborn. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from a number he didn't have saved, though he knew it by heart anyway. Heard about the bank thing. Whatever you need, Dad. Caleb, his son. The first message in 14 months, and it wasn't even really a message. It was a door left open a crack by someone who still had one foot outside it. Arlen typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. In the end, he wrote nothing at all, set the phone face down on the table, and went out to check the vines one more time before dark, because that, at least, he knew how to do. Dale Merritt's truck was already parked at the gate when Arlen came out the next morning with his coffee, which told Arlen 2 things. That Dale had heard about the bank letter faster than seemed decent, and that Dale wanted to be standing on Arlen's land, not waiting to be invited onto it. Arlen. Dale nodded like they were old friends, which they weren't, not really, though they'd known each other their whole lives the way everyone in a town of 600 knows each other. Dale was 58. Built like a man who'd worked outdoors his whole life, and had the tan and the forearms to prove it, and he ran Merritt Cellars 2 ridges over. The only winery in the valley that actually made money. The only one that got written up in magazines out of Sacramento. Dale, you got a minute? I got a bank letter and about 90 of them, so I guess I got a few to spare. Arlen sipped his coffee. What do you want? Dale didn't waste time working up to it, which Arlen respected even as he braced for it. I want to buy Hollow Row. It's not for sale. It's about to be sold whether you sell it or not, Arlen. That's how a foreclosure works. Dale said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. I'm offering you a way to walk away from this with money in your pocket instead of nothing. $60,000 for the 4 acres and the house. That's more than fair for land that hasn't produced a harvest since before my youngest was born. You want the house too? I want the whole parcel, yeah. Arlen looked past him at the vines, gray and knotted in the morning light, and thought about the knife in his kitchen drawer, and the green wood underneath the bark that nobody else in this conversation had bothered to check for. Why do you want it, Dale? You've got 200 acres of your own doing fine without mine. Something moved behind Dale's eyes, quick there and gone like a fish under still water. Land's land. I like having the whole ridge. That's not an answer. Dale's jaw worked. For a second, Arlen thought he might actually say something true, and then the moment closed back over like it had never opened. 60,000, Arlen. Think about it. You've got 90 days, and I'm not gonna wait for day 89 to make the offer again. He got back in his truck and drove off, and Arlen stood at the gate a long time after the dust settled, turning over the one thing that didn't add up, a rich man in a hurry to buy worthless land. He didn't tell anyone what he decided. Mostly because there wasn't anyone left to tell, but he decided it anyway, standing alone in the rows the next morning with his knife, and a legal pad he'd started using to track which vines showed green under the bark and which ones didn't. He wasn't going to sell. He didn't fully know why yet, not the real why, the underneath the bark why, but he knew the shape of it. Ruth had protected this land for reasons she never fully explained. And Dale Merritt wanted it badly enough to drive out here the morning after a bank letter went out, and those 2 facts sat next to each other in Arlen's mind like they belonged together, even if he couldn't yet say how. So he worked. Every morning before the county work, every evening after, he was out in the rows, cutting back deadwood, checking root crowns, hauling out decades of bramble and fallen branch that had grown up through the vine rows like the land was trying to swallow its own history. His hands, which hadn't done real farm work in years, blistered and then calloused. His hip, still healing, ached every night, and he iced it at the kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas Ruth used to keep for exactly that purpose, and he didn't let himself think too hard about that. Word got around, the way it does in a town with one traffic light. "Heard you're out there every day now," said the woman at the register in the general store, not unkindly, just curious the way people get about a strange animal. "Somebody's gotta be," Arlen said, and paid for his coffee and left before the conversation could go anywhere he didn't want it to. At the diner, he heard 2 men at the counter talking low, not realizing or not caring that he was in the booth behind them. Gonna kill himself out there over a vineyard that's been dead since Reagan. Grief does funny things to a man. Ruth's been gone 2 years, At some point you gotta let the dead things go is all I'm saying. Arlen paid for his eggs and left half of them uneaten and didn't say a word, because there was nothing to say to men who'd already decided what a thing was before they'd looked underneath its skin. That night, going through the tool shed for a pair of loppers, he found a box he didn't remember seeing before, pushed back behind a stack of old paint cans, its cardboard soft and gray with age. He almost left it. But something made him pull it out into the light of his flashlight, and when he opened it, he found photographs. Ruth as a girl maybe 8 years old, standing in these same rows when they were green and full and taller than her head. Grinning at the camera with a bucket of dark grapes almost too heavy for her to lift. Underneath the photographs, wrapped in a dish towel gone stiff with age, was a leather-bound ledger. He sat down right there on the shed floor and opened it. The handwriting was cramped and old-fashioned, fountain pen ink faded to brown, and it took Arlen a page to realize what he was reading wasn't farm records at all, not really. The first entries were dated, dry, practical, pruned north rows. Grafted new stock onto old roots, Belhaven cuttings survived the frost better than the others, will monitor. But by the third page, the entries had turned into something else. March 3, 1947. Told the girls another story tonight about the vines, how each one has to survive its own hard winter before it's strong enough to bear real fruit. Elena asked if that's true of people too. I told her it was. I don't know if I believe it, but I want her to. Arlen kept reading. The handwriting belonged, he realized slowly, to Ruth's grandfather, a man named Silas Colby, who Ruth had spoken of only rarely, always with a strange, careful tenderness, like handling something that might still be sharp after all these years. June 1952. Elena is gone 3 months now, and I still walk into the kitchen expecting to see her at the table. Her mother says I spend too much time in the vines and not enough time grieving properly, whatever that means. I don't know how to grieve a 6-year-old properly. I only know how to keep something alive. Arlen sat very still in the dust of the shed floor, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. I've decided not to harvest the Belhaven rose this year, or maybe ever again. Let them go wild. Let people think the vineyard is dying. A man came through in 51 asking too many questions about the old rootstock. Said a company out of the city wanted to buy up every pre-prohibition varietal left in California to patent them, strip them out, sell cuttings for a fortune, and leave the original growers with nothing. I won't have strangers digging up what's left of my daughter's favorite place on this earth to sell it to men who never knew her name. Better they think it's dead. Dead things people leave alone. Arlen closed the ledger slowly and sat with it in his lap for a long time, the shed dark around him except for the flashlight's narrow beam, and felt something shift in his chest like a stone rolling off a grave that had never actually held a body. The vineyard wasn't neglected. It had been hidden deliberately for 70 years, generation to generation, a secret disguised as decay, protecting something that mattered too much to risk. And underneath that discovery sat a second one, quieter, sharper. Aimed at himself. Ruth's grandfather had turned his grief into silence and called it protection, and passed that silence down like an heirloom nobody chose to inherit, down through Ruth, who'd never fully explained herself, down to Arlen himself, who'd spent 2 years alone in these rows instead of picking up the phone to call the one person who might have grieved right alongside him. He thought of Caleb's text, still sitting unanswered on his phone. Whatever you need, Dad. He'd been protecting something too, all this time. He just hadn't let himself see what. Before we go further into what Arlen found buried in his family's past, and what it would cost him to bring it into the light, if this story has you invested, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. Drop a comment below. Have you ever discovered someone in your family was protecting something you never understood? We read everyone. Now, back to Hollow Row. 3 days later, Arlen drove into town to see Marcy Boyle at the Belhaven Valley Agricultural Trust, the small local bank that had held Ruth's loan for 8 years without much trouble until this spring. Marcy had known Ruth since grade school. She looked uncomfortable the moment Arlen sat down across from her desk. I want to talk about the timeline, Arlen said. 90 days feels short for a loan that's been steady for 8 years and only fell behind because of a hip surgery. Marcy's eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the closed office door behind her, the one with a nameplate that read RMERRITT, Loan Officer. Arlen felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Merritt," he said, "as in Dale Merritt." "Randy's his cousin," Marcy said, low, glancing at the door again. "I shouldn't be telling you this, Arlen, but the file's been flagged for expedited review since March. That doesn't usually happen for a loan this small. Somebody higher up wanted it moved fast. Since March. Before my hip surgery even set me back." Marcy didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. Arlen drove home with his hands tight on the wheel, turning it over. Dale showing up the morning after the notice went out with an offer already in hand, like he'd been waiting for the letter to land instead of surprised by it. A cousin in the loan office. A file flagged for expedited review months before Arlen had even fallen behind. It wasn't proof of anything a court would care about, but it was enough to tell Arlen that the man who wanted to buy his worthless land wasn't gambling on worthless land at all. That night he called Caleb for the first time in 14 months. It rang 4 times before his son picked up, and there was a long pause on the line before either of them spoke. "Dad." "I found something," Arlen said, because he didn't know how to start any other way after 14 months of silence, and the vines had taught him that sometimes you just had to cut into the bark and see what was underneath. "I think you should come see it." Another pause. Arlen could hear faintly the sound of a television somewhere behind his son, 300 miles away in Sacramento, where Caleb had moved after the funeral, unable to stay in a town that only reminded him of his mother. "I can't just," Caleb started, then stopped. "Is this about the vineyard?" "It's about your mother," Arlen said, "and her grandfather, and you if you want it to be." He heard Caleb exhale, long and slow. "I'll think about it," Caleb said, which wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the hang-up Arlen had half expected either. It was a door, cracked a little wider than the text message had left it. Arlen mailed the ledger the next morning, no letter enclosed, just Silas Colby's 70-year-old handwriting wrapped in the same dish towel that had kept it safe this long, and a note on the outside of the package that said only, "Your mother would want you to read this. Dad." For 2 weeks, nothing. Arlen kept working the rows, running an internet search or two at the library in town, the closest thing Cutter's Hollow had to research access, trying to understand what he was actually looking at. What he found matched Silas's ledger almost exactly. A pre-prohibition varietal called Belhaven Noir, documented in a handful of agricultural surveys from the 1910s, believed extinct after a catastrophic frost in 1924, wiped out the last known plantings in the valley, all except apparently for 4 careful acres that one grieving grandfather had disguised as ruin. If Arlen was right, if the DNA matched what old botanical records described, Hollow Row wasn't a dead vineyard. It was possibly the last living stand of an extinct American wine grape, hidden in plain sight for a century. Which explained, with a clarity that made Arlen's hands go cold on the library's keyboard, exactly why Dale Merritt wanted it so badly, and exactly why he wanted it before anyone else found out what it was. He didn't have proof of that either. But he had a late frost warning on the county agricultural bulletin 2 nights before the earliest possible bud break, and 4 acres of newly pruned, newly exposed vines with nothing but his own 2 hands to protect them. He worked through the night, hauling every blanket in the house out to the rows, running extension cords from the barn to 2 space heaters he'd bought on credit he didn't really have. Standing watch with a thermometer and a flashlight until 3 in the morning, while frost crept silver across the grass around him and stopped mercifully just short of the vine rows themselves. Royce Tanner drove by around dawn on his way to open the feed store and slowed his truck at the fence, taking in the sight of Arlen, 71 years old, exhausted, wrapped in a coat with frost in his eyebrows, standing guard over gray wood that the whole town had already buried. He didn't say anything this time. He just looked for a long moment and then drove on. Caleb's truck pulled up the gravel drive on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, and Arlen was on his knees in the dirt when he heard it, and for a second he thought his heart might actually give out from something other than exertion for once. His son got out slowly, the ledger held in one hand like he wasn't sure whether to bring it inside or keep it close. I read it 4 times, Caleb said, by way of hello. I didn't know any of this. About great-great-grandpa Silas, about Eleanor. His voice caught on the name of the little girl who died 70 years before either of them were born, and Arlen understood, watching his son's face, that Caleb wasn't just moved by an old story. He was recognizing something in it. Your mom knew some of it, Arlen said. Not all. I don't think anybody alive knew all of it till I found this in the shed. Caleb looked past him at the vines, cut back now, pruned into something like order for the first time in a decade, buds swelling green along canes that had spent Arlen's whole marriage looking half dead. You kept working it, even before you found this. I made a promise to your mother, Arlen said. I didn't always keep it well these last 2 years, I know that. Caleb was quiet a moment, turning the ledger over in his hands. I should have come back sooner, after the funeral. Just being here without her felt like standing in a house with all the furniture pushed against the walls. Nothing was where it was supposed to be. He looked at his father, and something in his face was young again, the way it hadn't been in years. I'm sorry I left you out here alone. I let you think I wanted to be alone, Arlen said. That was on me too. Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. Arlen handed his son a pair of pruning shears, and Caleb took them, and the two of them worked the rows together until the light went gold and low over the ridge. Father and son bent over vines that had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of return. Dale Merritt came back on day 71, this time without the truck window casual approach. This time he came to the door, and there was less patience in him than there'd been 3 weeks before. You didn't call about the offer, Dale said. I'm not selling, Dale. You've got 19 days. I know what I've got. Arlen stood in his own doorway, Caleb a step behind him, and something in the two of them standing together seemed to register on Dale's face, a small flicker of recalculation. I also know your cousin flagged my file for expedited review back in March, before I ever missed a payment. Dale's jaw tightened. That's bank business, not mine. Funny how fast you showed up the morning after the letter went out then. Almost like you knew it was coming before I did. For a long moment, Dale didn't answer, and in the silence Arlen watched something come apart behind the man's carefully composed face. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to old grief finally finding a crack to leak through. You know what your wife's grandfather did to my father? Dale said finally, low. 1958, there was a boundary dispute over the ridge line between our properties. Silas Colby had the county surveyor in his pocket. Everybody knew it. Nobody could prove it. And my father lost 6 acres of good hillside to a line that got redrawn conveniently right through the middle of a stand of oaks my grandfather had planted. My father talked about those 6 acres till the day he died, called it the thing that kept Merritt Cellars small while the Colbys got everything. That's a 60-year-old grudge, Dale, and it's got nothing to do with me. It's got everything to do with you, Dale snapped, because I finally found a way to get some of it back, and you're standing in the middle of it acting like I'm the villain in your little story. The silence after that admission was total. Arlen felt Caleb go still behind him. So you knew, Arlen said slowly, about the Belhaven Noir, not just guessing, you knew. Dale's face didn't confirm it outright, but it didn't deny it either, and that was answer enough. My father wrote down what he suspected before he died, Dale said finally, quieter now, some of the fight going out of him. Said Silas Colby was hiding something valuable behind all that neglect, that no man lets good land go to ruin for no reason. I always figured it for an old man's bitterness talking. Then this spring I had a soil consultant out on my own land, mentioned the old rootstock survey records almost as a joke, and he told me what a stand of surviving pre-prohibition Belhaven Noir would actually be worth. To a collector, to a winery with a story to sell alongside it. He looked away, out toward the darkening ridge line. I told myself I was owed it. 6 acres for 4, might as well call it even. And the loan, Arlen said. You made sure I couldn't pay it back in time. Made sure the bank moved fast enough that I'd be forced to sell before I even knew what I had. Dale didn't answer that directly, but his silence did. I'm not proud of the loan part, he said finally. That was over a line I shouldn't have crossed. The land, though, I still think some of it should have been mine a long time ago. That part I don't take back. Maybe, Arlen said. but your father's grudge doesn't give you the right to bury mine before I even get to fight for it." Dale looked at him a long moment, then at Caleb, then back at the vines behind them, bud swollen and green in a way nobody in Cutter's Hollow had seen in a decade. He turned and walked back to his truck without another word, and this time Arlen noticed he didn't slam the door. September came in warm and gold, the way it does in the valley, and for the first time in 11 years, the rows at Overgrown Vineyard filled with the sound of shears and low conversation, and the soft thud of grapes dropping into plastic buckets. It wasn't a big harvest. 4 acres of vines coming back from a decade of neglect couldn't produce what they might in 5 more years of careful tending. Arlen knew that, had read enough by now to know the first real harvest would be small, imperfect, more proof of concept than triumph. But it was real. Dark clusters, dense and small-berried, hung heavy under leaves that had gone from gray-green to a rich, healthy color that made Royce Tanner stop his truck at the fence line 3 separate times that week just to look. Caleb had stayed the whole summer, taking work doing farm labor 2 towns over and coming home every evening to work the rows with his father, and somewhere in those months, the space between them had closed in a way neither of them talked about directly, because they didn't need to. They just worked side by side, the way Silas Colby and a 6-year-old named Alina once must have worked these same rows, 3 generations and a whole hidden secret ago. The town organized a harvest fundraiser at the community hall that year, a small event, folding tables and church basement casseroles, meant to raise money for the volunteer fire department, nothing to do with Arlen at all. But Marcy Boyle, feeling guilty about a conversation she probably shouldn't have had in a bank office, had quietly invited a friend of hers from Sacramento, a sommelier named Patricia Nkemelu, who consulted for small California wineries and had a reputation in certain circles for knowing pre-prohibition varietals better than almost anyone left working in the industry. Arlen brought a single case of the first small batch press, made in his own barn with Ruth's grandfather's old equipment, more out of stubborn pride than any real expectation. He set it on a folding table at the edge of the hall and didn't say much about it, because by then the whole valley had heard some version of the Whitcomb place is finally growing something again, and he was tired, honestly, of being the story everyone had an opinion about. Patricia Nkemelu found the table an hour into the evening, poured herself a small glass out of curiosity more than expectation, and went very, very quiet. She held the glass up to the light. She smelled it twice. She tasted it, closed her eyes, and stood there long enough that Arlen started to worry something had gone wrong with the wine. "Where did this fruit come from?" she asked finally. "My family's vineyard," Arlen said, 4 acres out past the Tanner place. "We just brought in the first harvest in 11 years. This tannin structure, the berry size, this particular spice note," she looked at him hard. "Has anyone tested this varietal, genetically I mean? Not officially. I've got some old records that suggest it might be a pre-prohibition strain called Belhaven Noir, supposed to have died out in a frost back in 24. Patricia set the glass down very carefully, like it had suddenly become something fragile and enormously valuable, which Arlen would learn over the following weeks it more or less had. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, "if this is what I think it is, you're not sitting on a dead vineyard. You're sitting on one of maybe 2 or 3 surviving stands of a wine grape that every serious viticulturist in the state thought was extinct." The room, which had been humming with its usual low fundraiser chatter, seemed to Arlen to go very quiet around that folding table, though later Caleb would tell him it hadn't really, that it had just felt that way, standing at the center of the moment he'd been protecting unknowingly. His whole married life. News moves fast in a town with 1 traffic light. And by the time the County Agricultural Extension Office confirmed Patricia's suspicion 3 weeks later, genetic testing, matching hollow, rose rootstock to preserved 1918 survey samples, with a confidence that made even the skeptical extension agent whistle low under his breath. There wasn't a person left in Cutter's Hollow who hadn't heard the words, "the Whitcomb place," an extinct varietal, in the same sentence at least a dozen times. The bank's foreclosure proceedings, still technically active on day 86 of the 90-day window, ground to an unceremonious halt the moment 3 separate wineries, and a state agricultural preservation fund inquired independently, and within the same week, about the possibility of a conservation loan or land trust to protect Hollow Row's remaining acreage. Marcy Boyle, for her part, made sure the paperwork moved through channels that had nothing to do with Randy Merritt's desk this time. Dale Merritt didn't come to the farmhouse again, but he sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised Arlen more than anything else that whole strange autumn, acknowledging in careful and clearly difficult language that whatever debt he believed the Colby family owed his own, it wasn't a debt Arlen or Ruth or Caleb had ever actually incurred, and that he was sorry for the loan if not entirely sorry for wanting the land. It wasn't a full apology. Arlen didn't expect one, and didn't especially need one. It was enough that the wanting had stopped being a threat and started being, at most, an old man's complicated grief about his own father, which Arlen, of all people, understood better now than he ever had before. The town stopped calling it the grave sometime around the second week of October, though nobody could have told you exactly when the shift happened. It just quietly became Hollow Row again, the way it was in the old photographs of Ruth as a girl, grinning under vines heavy with fruit. On the last Sunday of harvest season, Arlen stood at the edge of the rows with Caleb beside him, the two of them looking out over 4 acres that had spent 70 years disguised as ruin and 11 years as a punchline, and were now finally exactly what Silas Colby had protected them to become again. "You think Mom knew all of it?" Caleb asked. "The whole story?" "Not just pieces. I think she knew enough to trust it was worth protecting, even without all the pieces," Arlen said. "Same as I did, I guess, without really understanding why." Caleb was quiet a moment, turning a single dark grape between his fingers, holding it up to the fading light the way Patricia Nkemelu had held up that first glass of wine 3 months before. "Next spring," Caleb said, "I want to help you plant a few new rows. Expand it, do it right this time, not hidden, not a secret anymore." Arlen looked at his son and past him at the vines, and further still at the ridge line where the sun was going down gold and slow over a valley that had spent a decade certain there was nothing left worth digging for here. "Next spring," he agreed. They stood there together a while longer, the way you do at the end of a harvest, not saying much because some things, the important ones, the ones that took root under gray bark and stayed alive through every winter anybody was fool enough to write off as the last one, didn't need saying out loud anymore. They just needed tending. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more true-to-life stories of quiet resilience, hidden legacies, and land worth fighting for. Drop a comment below. What's one thing in your own family that looked abandoned but never really was? We read every single one. See you in the next story.